How the CIA secretly weaponized Hollywood in the Cold War. The lights fade, and the projector hums to life. It's 1954. In a packed London theater, the animated animals of Animal Farm rise against their human oppressor. The audience bursts into applause at the final scene. Tyranny has fallen, freedom restored. But what none of them know is that this wasn't George Orwell's original ending. Someone else had rewritten it. Behind the curtain of Cold War paranoia, one of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world had just turned art into a weapon. A few years earlier, George Orwell had died penniless and sick, unaware his work would soon be used for a purpose he might have found chilling. Within months of his death, unknown buyers acquired the film rights to Animal Farm. Those buyers weren't producers or distributors. They were frontmen working for the CIA. The agency had secretly purchased Orwell's story through British intermediaries, bankrolling an independent production to turn his allegory into polished propaganda. The budget ballooned to triple its initial estimate, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the message. In Orwell's book, the pigs became indistinguishable from the humans they replaced, showing that revolutions could devour themselves. In the CIA's version, the animals rise again, overthrowing the pigs, a cinematic twist meant to prove tyranny can be toppled through resistance. It was designed to spark hope, not cynicism, to persuade audiences that totalitarian systems weren't inevitable. The film wasn't just a parable anymore. It was a psychological operation. Thousands of viewers cheered that night, believing they were simply watching an adaptation of literature. They had no idea the edits were dictated from Washington, or that this film was quietly exported across Europe as part of a campaign to counter Soviet propaganda. It would take decades before the truth emerged, that Animal Farm was the CIA's first major foray into manipulating mass entertainment. But this wasn't some isolated experiment. This was the birth of a new type of warfare. The Cold War wasn't just fought with bombs and spies. It was fought through stories, symbols, and screens. To understand why this moment mattered, rewind to the late 194s. The Second World War had left the world split between two superpowers. The Soviet Union controlled half of Europe. The United States, still reeling from victory, confronted a strange reality, a battle for hearts and minds. Leaders in Washington realized that influence, the ability to shape what people believed, feared, and desired, could determine the outcome of this new global standoff. The CIA was created amid that anxiety. It wasn't just about gathering intelligence, it was about weaponizing information. The agency's early architects believed ideas could be mobilized just like armies. Where the Soviets had state-controlled cinema and cultural propaganda, the U.S. had Hollywood. And Hollywood meant influence. Movies reached millions, crossing languages and borders more easily than military alliances ever could. So when the CIA rewrote Animal Farm, it wasn't merely editing a screenplay, it was testing an idea. Could narrative serve as a form of psychological warfare? Could entertainment carry ideology quietly, invisibly, behind the mask of fiction? The early answer was yes. The cheers in that London cinema weren't for American power, they were for the restoration of hope, and that made it the perfect delivery system. Soon the pattern would repeat itself. Films, newsreels, even cultural festivals began to reflect subtle narratives about freedom versus control, prosperity versus oppression, the West versus the rest. Each story added another thread to an invisible web stretching across continents. Beneath the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, another story was being written, one directed not by filmmakers but by covert strategists. In the decades that followed, the same techniques refined in that animated barnyard would be applied on a global scale. The stage had been set, the players cast, and the world would never again watch movies the same way. Because in the Cold War's dark theater of influence, the screen itself had just become a weapon, the birth of a different kind of weapon. The guns had barely fallen silent when a new kind of warfare began, quieter but just as deadly. In 1945, the world emerged from the greatest conflict in human history, only to find itself split down an invisible line. On one side stood the United States and its allies, on the other the Soviet Union. Each claimed victory, but neither trusted the peace that followed. Cities were in ruins, economies shattered, and faith in governments fragile. Out of that wreckage came a contest not just for territory, but for belief itself. The battlefield was no longer only physical, it was psychological. The Americans had watched the Soviets move quickly to consolidate their influence across Eastern Europe. Communist parties? took root in Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest, each city adopting the same cultural blueprint: art that celebrated the worker, schools that praised the state, and films that glorified the revolution. Soviet cinema wasn't entertainment, it was evangelism for Marxism. To Western leaders, it was proof that ideology could be projected as power just as surely as a nuclear weapon. In Washington, that realization changed everything. The newly minted Central Intelligence Agency, established by the National Security Act of 1947, was more than just a successor to wartime intelligence. It was conceived as a peacetime instrument of influence, a way to keep the world aligned against the Soviet model. Its architects weren't only soldiers or spies. Many came from academia, journalism, and the arts, people who understood that narratives could move populations in ways brute force couldn't. Among them was Frank Wisner, a lawyer-turned-intelligence officer with an unusual vision. He believed that the United States needed what he called a mighty Wurlitzer, a global instrument the government could play to make entire populations hum to its desired tune. The metaphor was simple. When you pressed a key in Washington, the same melody would be heard in Paris, Rome, or Berlin. The keys in this case were journalists, artists, authors, and eventually filmmakers. Cultural output was no longer just a domain of artists. It was seen as an extension of statecraft. But there was a problem. America's democratic values made overt propaganda politically toxic. Unlike the Soviets, the U.S. couldn't just nationalize its film studios or dictate what stories were told. The solution, Wisner realized, was infiltration by invitation, subtle guidance through funding, partnerships, or mutual ideology. The CIA didn't need to own Hollywood. It only needed to whisper in the right ears. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Soviet Union had been doing the opposite for decades. From Eisenstein's montages of heroic revolutionaries to wartime epics like Alexander Nevsky, Moscow had long understood cinema's potential to craft loyalty. Their model was centralized, total, and ruthlessly efficient. Every reel that left Soviet studios carried a political payload. The heroism of the worker, the wisdom of the party, the corruption of capitalism. It was all part of the same cinematic language, repeated until it felt like truth. The Americans saw that system and realized they were outmaneuvered. Their films might dominate commercial markets, but the ideological battlefield was slipping away. European audiences, battered by war, were increasingly drawn to the utopian rhetoric of socialism. To them, American prosperity looked decadent, maybe even hollow. The Marshall Plan rebuilt factories and roads, but cultural influence required something more potent: mythology. Inside early CIA briefings, the term psychological warfare stopped sounding hypothetical. It became doctrine. The agency's Office of Policy Coordination, established in 1948, was tasked with defending democracy through covert influence. This meant financing radio broadcasts, sponsoring cultural festivals, and infiltrating press outlets under foreign-sounding names. But Wisner's ultimate ambition was cinema, the most glamorous, persuasive medium of them all. Here's where it gets complicated. The American film industry was already a global juggernaut. Hollywood's reach extended to Europe, Asia, and then America, selling not only entertainment but also a worldview, one built on freedom, wealth, and individual heroism. What Wisner understood was that this existing machinery didn't need to be reinvented. It only needed calibration. A small shift in what kind of hero appeared on screen, what kind of villain opposed him, could tilt perceptions worldwide. A love story could quietly reinforce capitalist ideals. A spy thriller could romanticize American intervention. A cartoon could turn the complex fight against communism into a simple tale of good versus evil. But getting the industry to cooperate required subtlety. The CIA couldn't simply walk into a studio and hand over talking points. Instead, influence flowed through intermediaries, producers with government ties, cultural organizations funded indirectly by U.S. agencies, and foreign offices managing film distribution abroad. The structure was deliberately opaque. Each layer distanced the agency from its creations, making the manipulation invisible. At the same time, Washington's official diplomacy relied heavily on hard power, nuclear deterrence, alliances, and aid programs. Yet the thinkers inside the CIA recognized that hard power couldn't sustain alliances alone. Populations needed to believe in the American promise. So while generals strategized about missiles, another team was charting storyboards, narratives designed to resonate across borders, shaping how foreign audiences saw both themselves and their supposed enemies. Hollywood was the perfect testing ground. During the war, filmmakers had partnered closely with the U.S. government through the Office of War Information, producing morale-boosting epics that blurred patriotism with entertainment. That relationship never truly ended. When peace returned, the Pentagon withdrew, but intelligence operatives stepped quietly into the vacuum. They preferred to influence rather than instruct, smoothing alliances behind the screen instead of in front of cameras. By the early 195s, the CIA's psychological warfare branch had evolved into a sprawling operation. Funds were funneled through non-governmental foundations that supported cultural events, academic journals, and yes, film projects. What these beneficiaries often didn't know was that their grants originated in Langley's shadow ledger. This approach gave the agency plausible deniability while ensuring the message stayed consistent. Freedom was glamorous, communism dreary, the West vibrant, the East oppressive. Every success reinforced Wisner's Wurlitzer analogy. When a narrative favorable to American interests appeared in a European newspaper, or a film portraying Soviet cruelty premiered in London, the melody played a little louder. And to the agency's satisfaction, most of its audience danced without ever knowing they were part of the orchestra. What began as a series of improvised experiments soon crystallized into policy. Culture became a vital front in the Cold War, as crucial as the arms race or the space race. The CIA wasn't manufacturing bombs, it was manufacturing consent. And it discovered that a well-told story, distributed through the glitter of cinema, could reach deeper than any broadcast or pamphlet ever could. This was the birth of that different kind of weapon, a weapon of ideas. It didn't rely on steel or firepower, but on emotion. It operated not on the battlefield, but in the imagination. The figures who wielded it weren't soldiers, but writers, directors, critics, some witting, some not. Yet their combined influence was enormous. While politicians argued over borders, Hollywood was already redrawing minds. As the curtain rose in the first decade of the Cold War, that weapon was ready for deployment. Art had become strategy. Storytelling had become statecraft. And the agency that once specialized in espionage now held the most powerful tool of all, the ability to decide which stories the world believed. The cultural Cold War begins. Frank Wisner's mighty Wurlitzer was no metaphor anymore. It started to play. Across post-war Europe, the CIA quietly built a network of organizations designed to shape the cultural battlefield. The idea wasn't to bludgeon audiences with propaganda, but to persuade them through prestige and sophistication, to win minds without them realizing they were targets. In the late 194s, this strategy took form under the newly created Office of Policy Coordination, the branch responsible for covert political and psychological operations. Its mission? Make democracy look irresistible and communism look joyless. Washington feared that the Marshall Plan's money couldn't buy loyalty on its own. Streets could be rebuilt, but trust had to be engineered. So the CIA turned to an older instrument, culture itself. Music, literature, theater, and especially film, all could communicate freedom better than any speech from the State Department. But there was a catch. The United States couldn't be seen dictating tastes or censoring ideas. Overt propaganda smelled too much like the enemy's playbook. The solution was to make influence look organic. That's where front organizations came in. One of the most influential was the Congress for Cultural Freedom, founded in 195 and funded through covert CIA channels. It appeared to be an independent association of intellectuals united by their belief in free expression. Behind the scenes, it was a psychological operations arm of U.S. foreign policy. The Congress organized music festivals, art exhibitions, and symposia in major European cities, lavish events showcasing the vibrancy of Western creativity. Jazz concerts in Paris, abstract art in Venice, modernist plays in Berlin, all presented as spontaneous expressions of liberty. Attendees never saw the budget lines hidden under innocuous foundations like the Farfield Foundation or the four-backed organizations that received CIA reimbursements. Wisner and his colleagues understood that prestige was ammunition. High culture mattered because the Soviets had long promoted themselves as intellectuals of the proletariat. By funding artists who championed individual expression, the CIA could demonstrate that freedom outperformed control. It wasn't just about defeating Marxism, it was about redefining what it meant to be modern. Journalism was an especially potent instrument. Under Operation Mockingbird's early framework, friendly editors at major newspapers and magazines were quietly recruited to spread viewpoints that aligned with American policy. Some received direct money. Others simply shared the ideology of resisting communism. These journalists became hidden amplifiers. A magazine in Paris might publish an essay celebrating Western art as a reflection of free minds, while another in Rome attacked the uniformity of Soviet realism. Both were orchestrated by Washington's unseen hand. What made this new front so dangerous was its subtlety. Soviet propaganda was authoritarian, marching portraits and heroic workers. American messaging traded in style and aspiration. Where the Soviets told people what to believe, the CIA encouraged them to feel what freedom looked like. Hollywood's glossy romances, jazz's improvisation, Pollock's chaotic canvases, they all conveyed one psychological message. In America, the individual mattered. Nobody needed to declare ideology when modern life itself served as proof of the system's superiority. The network spread fast. The CIA's cultural officers sponsored literary journals like Encounter and Monad, where writers such as Stephen Spender and Melvin Lasky advanced sophisticated arguments against totalitarianism without ever naming their benefactors. Poets were paid to attend conferences on freedom of thought. Critics were flown to festivals to judge avant-garde films that conveniently mirrored anti-Stalinist themes. Entire art movements, from abstract expressionism to experimental theater, gained global prestige, backed unknowingly by intelligence funds. Meanwhile, across the Iron Curtain, Moscow saw American jazz and cinema as toxic exports corrupting Soviet youth. That perception thrilled CIA planners. Every banned film, every censored album proved how threatening cultural freedom truly was. To them, the arts weren't side projects. They were evidence that ideas could erode authoritarian control faster than any tank division. In the same period, Hollywood was evolving too. Though most filmmakers had no direct contact with Langley, the cultural tide affected them. Scripts suddenly mirrored the rhetoric of freedom. American heroes defended democracy abroad or exposed tyranny at home. Even when intelligence agencies weren't mentioned, their ideals resonated through optimistic stories of perseverance and individual triumph. The CIA didn't need to control every film. It only needed the atmosphere of cultural competition to shape what studios deemed patriotic or marketable. By the early 195s, Wisner's office essentially ran an empire of ideas. It funded symphony tours, literary prizes, translation projects, even academic conferences critiquing Soviet philosophy. The machinery was vast yet invisible. Foreign attendees saw smiling American diplomats. They didn't see the case officers approving expenses. The money flowed through NGOs, universities, and foundation grants, layers of respectability concealing the central command. Each event generated goodwill that no official propaganda could replicate. Internally, the CIA described this initiative as the Cultural Cold War, a campaign to prove that democratic societies produced not only better weapons, but better art. The aim wasn't to eliminate communist culture, but to overwhelm it with vitality. Every jazz riff, every technicolor spectacle became a strategic countermove against drab socialist realism. If the Kremlin staged parades, the Americans staged ideals. And yet there was irony here. Many of the writers and painters who benefited from CIA-backed funding were themselves critics of conformity and authority. They'd have bristled at learning their independence was sponsored by intelligence officers, but secrecy was the whole point. Art worked best as persuasion when it appeared spontaneous, not choreographed. So grants were awarded through intermediaries who never revealed the true source, allowing artists to believe they were simply fortunate recipients of cultural patronage. The model proved so successful that it expanded beyond Europe. Articles praising democracy surfaced in Latin American magazines. African and Asian cultural festivals received anonymous Western sponsors promoting global artistic exchange. Each carried the same subtext: modernity equals freedom equals America. The CIA had discovered that influence scaled like any production. Repeat the formula, adjust for local taste, and export. Meanwhile, the Soviets responded in kind, launching film festivals exalting proletarian courage and sponsoring friendship societies that extolled socialist unity. The world became a two-way theater, each superpower trying to outshine the other's mythology. But America's advantage was its plausible deniability. While Soviet propaganda came stamped with the hammer and sickle, U.S. messaging hid behind celebrity and glamour. Nobody suspected the hand turned the real. By mid-decade, the Cultural Cold War was institutionalized. Departments across the CIA coordinated with the State Department and private philanthropies to ensure messaging coherence.
Success was measured not in overt victories,
but in shifts of sentiment. When European journalists called Soviet art dated, when students in Prague traded state-approved literature for smuggled American novels, those were the psychological metrics that mattered. And through all of it ran the same thread: stories. Whether projected on-screen or printed in journals, they shaped the collective perception of which side represented the future. The genius of the operation was that people rarely realized they were participating in a war at all. They thought they were choosing taste, style, and progress. In truth, they were following a carefully scored script. The CIA's grand orchestra of influence was now global. From the cafes of Paris to the cinemas of Tokyo, its melody played on, light, catchy, and unforgettable. The cultural Cold War had begun in earnest, and the world was humming along to a tune no one realized was written in Langley: Operation Animal Farm. George Orwell never lived to see his fable turned into a weapon. He died in January 1950, weak from tuberculosis, still writing warnings about power and corruption. Within months, CIA operatives began quietly purchasing the rights to his most famous work, not to honor its message, but to reshape it. Through British intermediaries and secret frontmen, the agency acquired the film rights to Animal Farm from Orwell's widow, Sonia Brownell. The deal looked legitimate, British producers offering generous terms, but every pound stemmed from covert U.S. funds. What appeared to be an independent transatlantic production was, in truth, one of the earliest psychological warfare tests of the Cold War. Its clear objective: transform a cautionary fable about the corruption of revolution into a cinematic sermon against Moscow. Production control went to Louis de Rochemont, the American documentarian famed for patriotic wartime features. His reputation as a dependable voice of democracy made him the ideal collaborator. De Rochemont's New York studio managed the picture as a British-American partnership, but paychecks and invoices were padded through CIA, finance fronts that disguised official spending as private capital. Budgets tell the story. By the time the last frame was shot, the final cost had ballooned to more than 3 times the planned £92,790 budget. This overflow was labeled under cultural outreach and consulting, yet CIA accounting books listed each payment as a psychological warfare asset. The inflated cost was not waste. Each extra pound was proof that Washington was investing directly in imagination as a weapon. When early drafts arrived at Langley, intelligence analysts combed through every frame. The original ending, animals and men becoming indistinguishable around the poker table, was flagged as ideologically self-defeating. A memo warned that Orwell's pessimism encouraged moral paralysis. The directive that followed was unambiguous: rewrite the finale to spark resistance, not despair. Agency script consultants replaced fatalism with hope. The animals now stormed the farmhouse once more, toppling their porcine dictators and reclaiming their freedom beneath a rising sun. A declassified note later summarized the decision: hope remains the most effective anti-communist message. The shift was surgical. Animators lightened tones, the composer rewrote the score into a major key, and light flooded every final shot. Propaganda became artistry. Despair turned into triumph. For de Rochemont, the command suited his instincts. A veteran propagandist, he viewed morale building as patriotic duty. His creative team believed they were making art. CIA planners logged emotional reactions as data. Where the studio saw storytelling, the agency saw measurable influence. The film premiered in London in 1954 before a full house. Audiences erupted in applause. Reviews praised its faith in liberty, unaware the ending had come from secret directives in Virginia. Embassy cables report a moving response from viewers cheering freedom restored. Inside Langley, those notes were tabulated as victory metrics. A children's animation had proven cinema could alter political emotion with precision. Distribution completed the operation. The Farfield Foundation and the Congress for Cultural Freedom, both CIA fronts, handled marketing, translations, and festival promotion. Radio Free Europe raffled tickets. Magazines tied to Operation Mockingbird ran glowing reviews authored by agency writers. Each review, every screening across Paris or Rome, was an invisible broadcast of policy wrapped in artistry. To every spectator, the narrative was simple. Tyranny can be overthrown, freedom is reborn, and in that allegory, America was the unspoken guide. Inside headquarters, officers declared Animal Farm a model success. It demonstrated that cinema could reach hearts where pamphlets and speeches failed. Propaganda no longer needed logos of government, only the warmth of sincerity. Encouraged by results, the CIA quietly aided another Orwell adaptation, 1984-1956. The fingerprints were familiar, despair tempered by courage, totalitarian cruelty balanced by human resilience. The film amplified rebellion over hopelessness, proving that the formula could scale. Orwell's words have been inverted into their opposite meaning. His critique of control now served the masters of it. Unlike Soviet pictures that celebrated the KGB, American cinema kept its intelligence services invisible. Yet every Hollywood narrative about vigilance and redemption echoed the same structure Langley had refined. Freedom threatened by tyranny, restored by courage. The method spread like template code through thrillers, epics, and animated tales alike. Documents declassified decades later confirmed the entire web: CIA financing, script interference, and covert global promotion under the banner of cultural freedom. A barnyard fable had become a morale operation, its altered ending repositioning despair as defiance. Animal Farm thus stands as the first full-scale experiment in cinematic social engineering, a precedent for all later cultural operations.